Hey, what's going on everyone? Greg here with RC Driver, and I'm back with part 2 of our Fix My RC Car series. We have been talking about drivetrains. Hopefully you saw part 1 where I talked about the wheel nut, the wheel hex, and the wheel pin. We're breaking things down in the drivetrain and the transmission into little parts, so hopefully if you have a problem with your RC car, you could see one of these videos, determine what your problem is, and fix it yourself. All right, today's episode, we're going to talk about spacers, bearings, and wheel nut tension. Okay, I've seen a lot of questions come in here about my wheel wobbles or my wheels kind of hanging up. What do I do? What could be the problem? And we're going to go and address those issues here today. So let's start off with the obvious here. You want your drivetrain to spin nice and free. You want those wheels to spin nice and free, but obviously you don't want them to wobble. You obviously want the wheel to be pretty firm. You don't want a lot of wobble here because a lot of wobble could cause problems within the drivetrain. It could cause wear and stuff like that. I'll talk about that a little bit more as I go. But what you really don't want here is you don't want this crazy wheel wobble going on. And what this is from could be a number of things, and we're going to go and break it down here for you. Now with some cars, a little bit of wobble is okay. The reason being is the axle has some space in there between the wheel pin and the other side of the axle shaft where the dog bone cup is. And so there's some space in there which allows the bearings to do their job and spin nice and free, because most setups don't compress the bearings. On a racing vehicle, there are a number of spacers and shims at the rear hubs that allow the bearings to be compressed and actually do their job very well. And then on some less expensive models, you'll have some space in there that allows the bearings to spin free. Now, don't get me wrong, having a little bit of space there in the wheel, isn't a big deal, but you do have to keep an eye on things to make sure that everything is spaced properly so you don't have excessive wear, which causes problems later on down the road. So let's say you do notice that your car has some excessive wheel slop. You could go and take the wheel off, pull the hex off, pull the pin off, and check your bearings first. Make sure your bearings are not blown out. And what your bearings will look like will be like this. And you'll notice that the center section could possibly be missing. Maybe the cover shields on the outside have fallen off, and you'll notice a lot of wobble, or the whole center section is completely missing. The balls are gone from the inside of the bearing, and that is causing your wheel wobble. The other side of it is it could be too much slop. Maybe you didn't shim it properly. Maybe you took it apart and maybe didn't replace one of the shims in there, and so that axle's sliding back and forth, and that's the problem you're encountering with too much wheel wobble. And when you have too much wheel wobble, what'll happen is it'll blow out the other bearing. If one bearing's bad, it could go and wear out the hubs. What it could also do is it could transfer that problem all the way up into your drivetrain. So everything in line could start to wear because of wheel wobble. So you could have your drive shaft start to wobble as well. Because of all that movement, it could start to wear out those components. And then when it gets to the drive cup at the transmission near the differential, it could start to wear out the differential output. It could wear out that bearing that the differential supports. So once you see wheel wobble on your car, you want to go and fix the problem. Now, there's a number of ways to fix the problem. Obviously, you could go back in there and add some more shims. Pretty much every company out there makes a shim kit of some sort, so you could properly shim the axle or replace the bearing. Obviously, if the bearing is blown out. And one thing to check is if you have been running with a blown out bearing, you do want to go and check the hub to make sure that the hub didn't wear, because even if you go and put a new bearing in, it slides in really easy and may move around in there. Now that bearing is not secure, and that wheel wobble is just going to continue. So you want to just go and check all those things so the problem just doesn't rear its head again. All right, so now when you go and put your new bearings in, or you're checking your shims to make sure everything is correct, it depends on the type of vehicle how much you want to shim. So a vehicle that doesn't have an internal spacer between the two hub bearings, you want to leave a little bit of space there. You want to put as many shims in as you can, but you need to have a little bit of space so when you tighten down on your wheel nut, it doesn't crush the bearings. Okay, this little spacer that comes in a lot of racing vehicles, it prevents that from happening. It prevents the bearings from getting crushed. And if you over tighten your wheel nut and it crushes the bearings, then you could have wheel drag, and that's kind of what I'm going to talk about in a little bit as well. So it's a little bit of trial to put the right number of shims on your axle and make sure that everything still spins free while taking up as much slop as possible. All right, so we talked about, replacing the bearings if you need to, properly shimming the axle. Once you've properly shimmed everything and you go and tighten everything down, I want to talk to you about wheel nut tension. And some people asked in the last video, how tight should I make the wheel nuts? And I kind of wanted to leave it to this video because it depends on the type of wheel hub setup that you have. If you don't have the crush spacers between the bearings, you need to tighten it down as tight as you can, but still making sure that the wheel spins free. If you have, the proper spacers set up like on a lot of race cars, you could go and really tighten those things down to make sure your wheel nuts are nice and tight. On a 10 scale vehicle, I like to say, use a specific hand tool. A T-wrench works really well, and tighten it down as much as you can. A 7mm hand tool for 7mm nuts works really well. And then when you get into like monster trucks and 5th scale, you really want to tighten those down as much as possible, but just go back and double check to make sure that the wheel isn't binding, because that you tightened it down too much and it's compressing on everything at the hub there. All right, now I think I got everything covered there. Moving on to your wheel is seized, okay? Your wheel does not seem to be moving when you're pulling the trigger. The possibility there is you do have a bearing that has seized up. And basically inside something happened and the bearing just isn't spinning free anymore. And once that happens, you'll notice your car is kind of pulling in one direction, loss of power. And you really want to go in there and obviously replace the bearing. If you continue to run with a seized bearing, well, that could cause issues on its own. It could go and start to wear away at the axle shaft that it's supposed to be spinning. And you'll wind up spending a little bit more money to replace all those parts later on down the road. So as soon as you notice that your wheel is seized up, stop, go home, hit the workbench, and swap out bearings. There's a lot of bearing companies out there. We use Team Fast Eddie. A lot of our cars are outfitted with his bearing sets. They're reasonably priced. All the manufacturers, obviously, you could get spare parts and replacement bearings from them, so definitely check that out. And when you do go back and put everything together, again, keep in mind making sure that you're spacing everything properly. Don't leave any washers out that were in there before. And if you notice some excess, maybe go and buy a washer set and use that to shim up the wheel properly. Now you might be saying, Greg, is there anything I can do to prevent all that from happening? Well, yeah, pretty much keep your car clean. After every run, go ahead and brush off the car. Make sure that you brush off any dirt near any bearings, because any dirt sitting there, even on a seal bearing, will eventually work its way in and start to grind away at the inside of the bearings. And that's what leads to your problems later on down the road. So keep everything as clean as you can. If you do feel that the bearing is kind of gritty and you want to save it, there are like bearing tools from RPM that you go use motor spray to clean out the bearings if you want to. At the very least, go get a micro oiler. This one's from Dynamite. It's a medium oil. Put a drop on the bearing and let it seep in. If you're running in harsh conditions, like running your truck through water, mud and stuff like that, water getting into the bearings, it's what's going to deteriorate them and cause them to fail later on down the road. So keep all that in mind. Keep things clean. If you're going through water, make sure you do something to get the water out of that stuff. And, worst case is you have to go buy some new bearings later on. But I think that wraps up part 2 of our series. I think that gives you an idea of what you have to look at for that specific area of the car. Moving on to part 3, I'll give you guys a little inside look. We are going to talk about the drive shafts, the axles, the universals, and what could happen there as far as problems and what to do to fix it. I hope you guys have subscribed to our channel so you can see more Fix My RC Car series videos. Hit that notifications bell so you don't miss any. Please give the video a like. If you have a question, comment, or even a tip, please put it in the section below so you could help out other people in our RC community. When you have some extra time, head over to rcdriver.com, and after that, go drive something.